Hello, hello. Welcome to the Global Citizen Therapy Podcast, the podcast for women of color who are daughters of immigrants to feel seen, heard, and validated. My name is Nancy Diaz, and I am a trauma-informed therapist, speaker, and your podcast host today. And now, let's jump into today's episode. Hi. So today's episode is going to be another one where I guess we dive into a bit of my own personal lived experiences. I was going to do a bit of a more educational one today, but the votes came in on Instagram and you all wanted to hear about what it's like dating in Australia versus dating in the US and just some of those cultural differences. So that's what this episode is all about. And yeah, I'm happy to share my experiences and things that I've noticed and some of the differences. I do think that sometimes I think there's a few people that maybe listen to the podcast or follow me on Instagram or on other socials, and they may not even realize that I'm in Australia. I actually realize I don't talk about it too much, but there definitely are. And I, just walking around outside and, hearing the accents and just noticing different things, I'm always kind of still comparing a bit, right? And still kind of blown away sometimes by some of these cultural things that I'm like, oh wow, that's quite different the way that they do things here. So yeah, let's let's go ahead and dive into it. So I have been dating a bit more, in the past recent months, so I can share a bit of how that's going. Um, I did a bit of dating in Perth when I lived in Perth, Australia, which if you don't know, that's on the other side of Australia. So that's in Western Australia. That's the name of the state. And so, yes, Perth apparently is, the number one most isolated city in the world. Uh, Although, yeah, I haven't fact checked this anyway, but it is like super isolated, right? It's very far away from any other city. And so that's just to give you a bit of a bit of context there. So that's actually when I started dating in Australia, was when I lived in Perth. So before that, I actually didn't do like any serious dating. I had some casual hookups, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Casual hookups when I was in Sydney and a teeny bit when I was traveling around Australia. But yeah, for the most part, I had a pretty low libido. So yeah, didn't actually, experiment too much, I think up until maybe last year or so. And, it's interesting, and I have kind of wondered about why this was. And, I did kind of think like, oh, is it actually, is it because I'm on birth control? Like, because the more that I learned about birth control and what it actually meant to be on it, I realized like, oh wow, there's this, and I knew this, I think, even since I've been on it, but there's more and more talk about the effects of hormonal birth control on our bodies, right? And so I've been on a journey, I think for the past 3 years, where I've really been like learning a little bit more here and there, and, reading things and listening to things and talking to people about, what their experiences have been like with hormonal birth control. And, I have talked to a lot of women who, yeah, they say that their libido, it just drops, and that's one of the one of the downsides with hormonal birth control, and doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense, right? You go on birth control, like oftentimes, right? Not always, I know, but at least for me, I went on birth control so that I wouldn't get pregnant. And it was, yeah, interesting that then, like when I moved to Australia, I was like, oh, like I actually noticed like my libido is quite low. And but I was like, you know what? But I've been on hormonal birth control. I was on the shot since like 2012. So I was like, and when I was in a relationship and the sex was great, no, my libido was very high. So I was like, I don't think that it's that. But then again, you just don't know, right? And that's why I was like, your body changes and you change, and and I was like, how much of it is psychological, that I feel like maybe I want to be in a committed relationship, for me to be wanting sex all the time, and how much of it is, something's happening like biologically in my body, right? being affected by these hormones that I'm pumping myself with every 3 months, right? So anyway, about 2 years ago, I finally got off the shot. And yeah, to be honest with you, I didn't, other than my period coming back, I hadn't had a period. So that's a whole other interesting thing, right? That I didn't have a period, yeah, since 2012, from 2012 until 2021. So yeah, that's a long time to kind of go without that whole female experience, you know? And so yeah, and I always kind of thought like, oh, it's a good thing, right? That yeah, that I don't get periods. I don't have to deal with, the mood swings and the cramps and the annoyance of the bleeding and maybe getting stained or whatever, right? But yeah, I've actually, and yeah, I think I did kind of hate it at first when it came back, and I was like, oh God, like, no, I didn't miss, not having it. But now I'm kind of, yeah, I'm learning more about our cycles and yeah, feeling like very empowered and very much like, okay, I actually like can know so much more about my body just by having a period again, right? So but yes, as far as libido, that's still to be determined. I'm not going to pretend to know everything here, but I do think that part of it is psychological, and I have kind of realized that, the more that I go on these dates and things like that, like yes, I think my preferences change, right? And I'm not talking about like wanting to date women all of a sudden as well. No, but I just mean that, yeah, there are some times where I'm in the mood to, just go on a date. And even if I know that it's something casual and it's not going to be serious, sometimes I am in the mood just for a hookup. That happens more rarely, but sometimes, the mood strikes. But yeah, for the most part, I am more like looking for a serious committed relationship, right? But yeah, it has been interesting dating, in Australia, and definitely when I compare it to, the guys that I dated either seriously, casually, or even the hookups that I had in the US, it's very different. And it's so interesting, right? So I actually oof, I noticed the first thing that I noticed was with Tinder, right? So Tinder in the US is is so different that I remember, and not just me, but I know like a few of my friends, who were on Tinder, we would get like inundated with likes and matches on Tinder, right? Okay, sorry. I'm thinking now I'm confusing Hinge and Tinder. So Tinder, it's the matches, right? So we would get inundated with matches. It would pretty much be like whoever you swiped right on, it's almost for sure that you'd get a match with that person, right? But then what we'd get inundated with is actually the messages, right? Because on Tinder, you swipe and you get matched, and then you get the message, right? And that's how it worked in the US, right? That if you got a match, you could expect right away to have a message from that guy almost instantly, right? They were like on top of it and messaging you. And yeah, and there were a lot of them who'd just say, hey, or what's up, or sup, or hello, or something, right? And those are, especially because we had so many to read through, those are the ones that maybe we wouldn't respond to unless there was something about their profile or their photo that maybe, like attracted us and made us want to like message back and, start the conversation, things like that. But yeah, for the most part, like I know that all of us were just kind of like, oh, Tinder's like a whole other part-time job just to respond to all the messages, right? And that was kind of like the running joke, at least with, me and my friends who at the time all happen to be Latinas, right? That's so yes, and just to kind of give a bit of context of what it was like dating in the US and Phoenix, where I am from, right? Lots of Latinos. And so yes, my friends at the time all Latinos, right? And yes, over here, very few are actually Latinos. And over the past 5 years that I've lived in Australia, yeah, it just has been, there's just less Latinos than, people from other countries. I think I think I was looking at something that there's about like 40% 40% of people in Australia are Latino. Someone else had looked this up, so I haven't fact checked this. But then I've heard other stats that say that it's a lot lower. So to me, I just think like, oh, I guess it kind of depends if they're counting backpackers, right? Because there's a lot of people from South America that come and maybe they stay here for a year or two and then they go back, or they might stay an even shorter time, maybe 3 months or 6 months. They work, they travel, they see the country, and then they take off. So I guess probably I would assume those stats are so different because it might be counting the people that are permanently here. And also I guess depends if you're counting the first gen or second. I think in Australia they use the term second gen more to refer to daughters of immigrant parents. So I guess it depends if you're counting Latino Australians, all these things, right? But yeah, all that to say that over in the US, I dated kind of and hooked up with mostly Latinos because that's just kind of what there was. And over here, I have very rarely dated or hooked up with a Latino. So yes, there's also, and I say this because yeah, that's an important thing to kind of know is that yeah, my experiences, I'm not going to be able to compare too much the typical white American European kind of background um to the white Australian, you know. So yes, but if I were to kind of even just compare Tinder, so in Tinder over in the US, very much, yes, the men do a lot of the heavy lifting. They will be the ones to message right away, to keep the conversation going. They usually would be the ones to like right away want to meet up. There were even on Tinder, I think, and this is like back in God, when was I last on Tinder in the US? Because I was dating someone for 3 years before moving to Australia. So I guess it probably would have been like 2015, the last time that I was on Tinder in the US. So it has also been a while. So also wanted to say like things could have changed over there by now. Maybe they have with Tinder, who knows? But yeah, cultural, I don't know. I don't know if it's, that Latinos are more likely to send a message first, right? Or, to want to meet up right away or that kind of thing. But yeah, in the US, I definitely found that Tinder was very easy to use and not a lot of effort on my part other than responding to messages, and then I decide if I wanted to meet up with them and that kind of thing. Versus in Australia, what I found right away and kind of shocked me was that no, you might swipe, swipe, swipe and not necessarily get that many matches, but even if you do get a match, it's like almost 90% certain that they won't be the first ones to message. And that's been my experience. And I have talked to a few friends who've had the same kind of experience in Australia. And especially when we're comparing like countries that we're from, they're like, oh yeah, it is kind of weird here that they don't message first, right? And but then it's interesting that when you go on the Bumble app where, the female has to message first, even when I message first on Bumble, I actually don't use Bumble anymore because I just found like I don't think that many people, I don't know if it's that not a lot of people use the app or check the app or whatever, right? But I was like, I'm messaging first because that's kind of like what you have to do, right? If you want to use the app, but still I'm not getting responses back. So I was like, okay, well, but anyway, yeah, same with Tinder that yeah, and even if I, make that first move and message that person that I matched with, then yeah, I still might not get a response. So it's interesting, right? That it just seems like maybe the men in the US and the Latinos over there mostly, right? They're like very eager to meet up, very eager to message and all these things, right? Whereas here, I don't know, it just seems like there's a bit of lack of effort. And so yes, I think that with the apps has been really interesting to just kind of see like, oh wow, I kind of feel like, it's like pulling teeth with these guys here in Australia to get them to message back, to get them to meet up, all these things. And yeah, it just does require like a lot more effort, right? And so yeah, and I think even I don't know, cultural thing maybe as well, but in the US, like I think there were even on Tinder. So Tinder is known as a hookup app, right? But what I found is that I don't know. Tinder worked well, just as well for going on dates and maybe even meeting potential partners. And again, I mentioned that this is like way long time ago, right? And so, the way that people use and think of Tinder now might also be different, right? So I haven't used Tinder in the US since many years ago, so that also could be one of the things, right? So, but yeah, I remember like back then when I was using it, it was pretty easy to find dates. And, me being like young, single, and just thinking definitely wasn't much of a feminist, I think, back then. And I just had a lot of fun. I would call myself not a gold digger, but a food digger. And so I would go on as many dates as possible, sometimes just for the free meal, because yeah, that is like the culture over there, right? That yeah, the guy will always pay, right? Like I'd say like 99% of the time, that the guy's gonna pay. Whereas over here in Australia, no, I don't think that there's as much that expectation that the man will pay. So that is very interesting, right? And like now kind of where I'm at, I also like paying for myself, right? And so if I go on a date now with someone here in Australia, I will, usually, so another thing like that's kind of weird and different here. So in the US, it's very easy to split bills, and it's also very easy to transfer money to another person, that kind of thing. When I came to Australia, I was very surprised that they don't really split bills here. It's not really a thing. And I mean now it's changed a little bit. Now I think more restaurants and more bars are used to splitting bills and they can do it more easily. But I think when I first arrived 5 years ago, it was, yeah, very unlikely that they would be able to split a bill. And then, yeah, I mean, in the US, I was just so used to like, oh, we have Venmo and we have what's the other app called? Square? No. But we could like send someone money like very easily, instantly on Facebook Messenger, for example, and like all these other apps, the Cash App, I think it's called, like all these apps. And then when I moved here, they didn't have any of that. And actually, like if you wanted to transfer money to someone, you could do it through your online bank. But if you had different banks, it might take a few days. And like it was a whole thing. Now I think it's a bit quicker and it's a bit better. And I think there is an app here now. I actually don't use it because now I think the banks are pretty quick that and I think I just got used to it, honestly. Like I don't even I don't even worry about that anymore. But I think when you first arrive and something's a lot slower or different than what you're used to, you're kind of like, oh wow, that's inconvenient, right? But yeah, very interesting that that here, it's just I guess more of an equal kind of culture, right? And it's interesting that the very first time that I went out in Sydney, so I actually came here with a friend who's also a Latina and who also was very much kind of in her food digging, a little bit more gold digging as well, gold digging days where yeah, she very much wanted to find the sugar daddy, right? And wanted someone to pay for her and was kind of used to getting special treatment, being, a beautiful Latina and things like that. So she was actually the one who taught me that when you go to a club like in Phoenix, or a bar and it has a long line, then you don't have to wait in that line, right? If you're young, you're pretty, whatever, you can go to the front of the line and just show your ID and smile at the bouncer and in you go. And I was like, oh my God, this whole time I've been waiting in this really long line. And she's like, no, you don't need to do that. Look, come with me. And yeah, and I think I tried it a few times without her and I was like, oh yeah, wow. But yeah, of course, funny thing, like if we happen to be with any guy friends, then that trick wouldn't work. So then what we'd end up doing, which is kind of messed up, we'd leave them in the line and we'd go in, get some drinks, dance, and whatever. And an hour later, they would finally get through the line and come inside with us. But yeah, I mean, that was actually kind of messed up. Probably should have waited in line with them. But yeah, young young single 20s in the US is not too bad because yeah, you don't have to pay a cover. I don't think you ever had to pay a cover in Phoenix if you're young, single, pretty, just being female, right? You get in for free, you drink for free, guys buy you drinks all the time, especially if it's your birthday. And that's why my friend, like I learned so much from this friend, right? So she would sometimes wear like a birthday sash or something, that said that she was 21, even if she was turning 23 or 24, right? And yeah, just so she could get even more free drinks and more like special treatment and all this stuff. And yeah, so very interesting, right? So anyway, came here to Sydney with her. We go out for the first time in Sydney, and and what's funny is that this is my first club in Sydney, and when we went, I was kind of curious like what the music would be like in Australia, right? And I was like, oh wow, that's kind of a disappointment. Like it's kind of the same as like back home. Like these are all like songs I know, right? But interestingly enough, like because I think we went to a bar that's very much like a backpacker bar, and just a lot of other like foreigners, like tourists, I guess, or whatever, backpackers, people here traveling through. And so yeah, there were people from, you could tell, from all different countries, which was cool. But we were dancing, and then right away, I can't remember if the guy came up to me or came up to her. But either he grabbed her ass or my ass or something. Anyway, point being, this was 5 years ago, but I I just ended up just getting so annoyed that I don't think I punched him, but I think I elbowed him hard in the ribs. And of course the bouncer saw me, like instigating something, and that's what he thought. And so we ended up having to leave. I think we got kicked out of that place. But yeah, so interesting that, that's the kind of the first experience. And I actually just went back to that bar about a month ago because that's where the Mexican Independence Day event was. And I hadn't actually been to that bar, hadn't thought about that bar, hadn't ever come across that bar in the 5 years that I've been here. But ironically, I was like, oh my God, this looks like the place where I first went out in Sydney. And look at that. So yeah, disappointing first experience that, that happened. But I also think like, oh, I don't know that that's kind of like a typical like experience in Australia because, it is very different if you go to a bar or a club where, it's mostly like people from other countries, versus if you go to like a bar or a pub, I guess we use the term pub here in Australia, and it's mostly like white Aussies, very different experience, right? But I will also mention that, she and I were both kind of shocked that just to get into this. So this is also the other weird thing that we were kind of both shocked by. So in the US, a club is like a very, very big space, and there's tons of people and tons of dancing and music, and like it's a great environment, right? And here, what they call a club, I would call a bar because they're really small and they're kind of like there's not much that goes into these clubs. So to me, the only one that I would consider a club is the Ivy Club here in Sydney, because that one is like, I think there's 3 stories, there's a rooftop pool or something. Like there's a lot that happens. That's the one that I would call a club. But here, like even what I would call a pub or whatever, like people might say that it's a club just because it's, but here it's also different because this is kind of one of the things that I do love is that a lot of pubs are like hotels as well. And whether it's like still an in-service hotel or not, some of them are, some of them aren't. But yeah, they will have like multiple levels, right? And so you have to go like up the stairs. So it's quite small, like the dance floor area is quite small, but then you might go up to the second level and it might either be the same music or different music, but and then you could keep going. And some have a rooftop and whatever. And yeah, they're like old buildings, and some of them, if they've like maintained them, like they're quite cute, and it's a good time and all this stuff. So yeah, very different, very European. But the thing with at least with that club that we went to the first time, and I know with Ivy Club, we went to that one as well, I think a few weeks later. And we were both kind of shocked that we were expected to like stay in the line, even though we're women, and that we had to pay a cover charge. And yeah, I remember my friend was like, oh my God, $20 cover charge? I've never paid a cover charge in my life. And I think the next week I ended up going with a new friend who is a Chilena. She's from Chile. And she was saying like, no, what? Like, this is great. I mean, she's like very like feminist, right? And I think she's like the first like kind of feminist that I met, like activist, like feminist, like she was great, right? And she's like, no, like, don't you want us to be equal? Like being equal starts with us also paying cover, with us also waiting in line. And I had never thought about it like that, but I was like, wow, cultural difference. But you're right, I like it. I was like, okay, yeah, maybe we should just wait in line and pay cover, just like the men do, and not get special treatment. And yeah, I do kind of think like, I wonder, is that why, I've been sexually harassed less in Australia than I have been in the US, right? Especially when you go to a club in the US, I think it's very common, very, very common that a guy will just come up to you and start grinding on you from behind or sometimes even from the front. Like some of them are just shameless and they will just be very pushy and, some of them even aggressive. And yeah, won't take no for an answer and just will think like, no, this is a club. We're all dancing, like there's a bunch of people here. Like this is just, and yeah, and it was like socially okay, I think in Phoenix. Whereas here, I I think it did take me a bit of time to adjust because at first I did take it kind of personally and I internalized it and I was like, oh my God, is it because I'm getting older? Am I less attractive now? Like the guys here aren't coming up to dance with me, they're not just grabbing my ass like, not that I would get mad about that sometimes, but of course, it is kind of the thing of like, you know yeah, it means that they like the way you look and that kind of thing, right? um I've done my own work on self-esteem and body image and things like that to the point where I don't think that way anymore and I'm not affected by the fact that these things don't happen. But even another thing that I found weird is that in the US all the time you would get honked at, right? If you're a woman walking down any street, doesn't matter where, you would get honked at. And all of a sudden when I came here to Australia, that didn't happen, and I didn't see that happening to anyone, but I didn't see it happening to me. And I was like, is this just not a thing? And I know like Sydney is a big like city and tons of cars and traffic. So I know that they have horns and they honk, they're very impatient drivers, right? And which is why I don't drive in Sydney. God, I hate driving in Sydney whenever I do have to do anything. Like so yeah, I know that people honk. They're very quick to honk if are just at the green light for 2 seconds too long, right? But yeah, as far as like honking at women, no. And actually, I saw a really interesting post. There's an Americans in Sydney and an Americans in Australia Facebook group. And I think it was in one of those that someone actually posted about the same exact thing. And this was just this year, I think like a few months ago that I saw this post. And it was talking about the same thing. Like, wow, I went back to the US recently and I had forgotten what it was like to be honked at. And so like she actually looked this up and apparently it's considered like yeah sexual harassment here and it's not okay to do. I think it's illegal, I think is what her post said, and I didn't have the time to fact check this, but yeah, very interesting, right? That whether it's actually illegal or it's just like a cultural norm or whatever not to do this, yeah, it's not done here. And same thing with like guys won't generally just come up to you. And so yeah, so it makes it easier, to feel safe. And on the other hand, and I've talked to friends who also think this way too, of like, oh, it's like harder for us to date and to meet people because, guys don't like always seem very keen. Well, like they use the word keen here instead of down. As well. So wow, that just came out naturally. Yeah, I've clearly been here too long. But yeah, they just don't seem as eager, right, to talk to a woman at a bar. But I also just think like, I've been thinking about this lately too, of well, we're also used to these apps now, right? We're used to dating on apps. We're not used to meeting people in real life, talking to people in real life. We're also now so used to being able to look at someone's pictures, know a bit about them, maybe where they're from, maybe what they're looking for, and especially like Hinge with those prompts, like you can get quite a lot of information from certain dating apps and someone's profile, right? So yeah, I did kind of think like, wow. And sometimes I'll be out with, like I went out with my friend last weekend and I was just like in a great mood and I was just like, okay, she wanted to go to the pub. I actually wanted to like chill by the campfire, but she was like, oh, we're right by the pub. Like, let's go to the pub. And I said, okay, well, great. Let's do it. We'll go to the pub. So I got ready and yeah, and when we got there and we were having our drinks, I told her I was like, all right, I'm in a great mood. I'm feeling like very like open and just yeah, let's meet some people. Like let's actually like make an effort tonight to talk to some people tonight. And interestingly enough, she got out her phone and was like, okay, but let me check the apps and see like who's on here and whatever. Like I'm just curious, like because we were like 6 hours away from Sydney. We were like in a very tiny little town. And so it was mostly white Aussies all around us, right? I actually got shocked that I think I saw two Latino families there. And usually when I go like outside of Sydney and yeah, to any like small little town where it's mostly white Aussies, if there is any diversity, it usually will be South Asians or East Asians, just because there's more of those ethnic groups here in Australia, right? But yeah, I was like, oh my God, I heard Spanish and I was like, what? That's great. But yeah, anyway, at that particular pub, yeah, we didn't meet anyone. It was very interesting that she got out the apps right away. And I was like, oh, we're just so kind of hooked on these apps that even though we're here, we could meet someone here just by talking to someone, right? But instead, the go-to and what's easier and less awkward is, getting out your phone, going to the apps, seeing if you match with someone, and then meeting up with them, even if you might happen to be at the same pub, because there was only one pub that was really going off in that tiny town, right? And yeah, but it was very much locals. There's a term here, I guess, the term redneck is used in the US. Over here they're called bogans, right? So it was kind of one of those really small towns where, where I was just trying to be very open, right? And I was like, oh, what about those guys over there? They're kind of cute. And she's like, yeah, they're kind of cute. And then I saw like, oh, they're smokers. And I have a thing where I'm like, yeah, cigarette smoke, just no, it makes me gag, right? And and for her, it was like, oh, like they seem like they're into some stuff. Like I think they might be on drugs, or I think they left to go buy drugs. And I was like, okay. So it was just that type of like, yeah. And then we did end up chatting with some guys and just asking typical tourist questions. And yeah, they seemed to all know each other. They were all locals, right? So it was kind of interesting that they knew that we were tourists, and I think just didn't really want to have anything to do with us. They were nice enough and chatted with us, but yeah, very interesting. And I think that is kind of what I've found with Aussies is that it can be, a bit hard to talk to them. And, on the last episode, I talked about, the fetishization of women of color. And so I guess you have to be like mindful of that as well when it comes to, the white Aussies. I don't know if I mentioned this in the last episode, but yeah, the first time that I hooked up with a white Australian here in Sydney, or like in Australia, I happen to be in Sydney, but it was interesting because yeah, one of the first things that he told me when we were in bed was like, oh, I want you to call me papi. And I was like, what? He's like, I want you to speak in Spanish to me. He's like, that's hot. And I was like, I don't, what do you want me to say? Right? I was like, this is weird. And so then I finally told him, I was like, no, I'm not gonna call you papi because that's what I called my dad growing up. So yeah, that's not gonna happen. He's like, oh my God, I didn't even know that that's what that meant. And so yeah, that was my first experience with an Australian. But I will say that that is technically like some of the best sex that I've had was actually with the first Australian that I slept with in Australia, right? Um so yeah, so that was interesting that we had such great sex. And that is one thing that I will say about Australians is this is my experience, but I think that Australian guys, they're pretty good in bed. And yeah, and they do like know what they're doing. They do know how to pleasure women. And yeah, that's kind of been my experience. And even like dating in Perth, like, oh man, that was interesting, right? So Perth, I haven't talked too much about my time in Perth, but Perth is like, yeah, most isolated city in the world. And it's also like it's a mining town or city, I guess, right? And so I think it's something like 90% of people that live in Perth work in the mines. And so it's kind of like this fly in, fly out situation where they like will fly out to whatever tiny little middle of nowhere, not even a town, but to the middle of nowhere in Western Australia, and they will be there for 3 weeks working in the mines. And they might be not necessarily working like in mines, but maybe they have other jobs, but they're it's at the mine site, whatever. and then they will come back to Perth, and then they will have, whatever they might do, 3 weeks there and 1 week off or whatever, like whatever their roster is. There's different rosters. So it was interesting kind of that was kind of the dating pool out there. So I did casually date a few FIFO workers. FIFO is what they call the mine workers, right? And it was very interesting that they yeah, a lot of them had never left Western Australia, had never even been to Sydney. A lot of them had not left Australia at all. Yeah, it was kind of like interesting that they made so much money working in the mines, but they would usually, buy a big, nice house and spend their days and their time off just drinking and sometimes gambling. And because like sex work is legal here, sometimes spend it on sex work too. So yeah, very, very interesting kind of dynamic. But yeah, I will kind of say like going on dates with them wasn't always the most interesting for sure. And usually we didn't have that much in common. And yeah, I found it hard. And I think this kind of goes across the board, across cultures and stuff, that men just struggle to, ask us these questions, about, oh, like, other than like what do you do for work and where are you from, then they don't really. And I don't know if it's nerves or I don't know if it's, like a gender role kind of thing, where they just kind of think like, no, I'm the man, I'm supposed to talk about myself and whatever. But yeah, some of those dates did drag on and were pretty boring because they weren't asking me anything about myself. They were mostly talking about themselves, or yeah, I would have to be the one, asking them questions to get them to talk about themselves. Or sometimes I think I have, said like, hey, you haven't asked me anything about myself. Like, is there anything you want to know? And then they might ask something. But yeah, for the most part, they're not very good at thinking of these questions on their own. So usually, on the apps, I used to do this quite a bit more. Now I don't have a lot of time for this, but I do like playing, like question games, where we just like ask like rapid fire like questions just as a fun way of getting to know each other. um, but yeah, and I found that kind of breaks the ice and is something like fun and yeah, a good way for us to kind of both feel like we're getting to know each other instead of it being very one-sided. But yeah, I mean that's kind of been my experience. What I would say about Australians, very good in bed. I don't think that I would personally like seriously date an Australian. I think that there's just too many cultural differences. There's often a lot of white privilege with them. I have, even just recently, yeah, I guess a friendship ended because I was friends with a white, well, this is actually a German that's been here in Australia for a while, but yeah, made a very like racist comment or comments, I guess, about Indians. And, when I called him out on it and, you know, um, actually I did pretty well in, I think, calling in. It did activate me and I realized like I got to take a step back from this, and really like yeah, because I was like very much like, oh my god, I've known this guy for like 2 years, and we don't live in the same city, we don't hang out much, but we do like talk sometimes and things like that. And I was like, I don't know, I'm kind of shocked by this, but at the same time not shocked, you know what I mean? um but yeah, when I sent him like some resources and told him like, hey, there's this training you can do to kind of learn about like what's okay, and like yeah, start this anti-racism journey and learning about your own privilege, right? No response. And so I was like, okay, I think that's kind of where we leave it. But yeah, and I think that's kind of one of the main reasons that I wouldn't date a white Australian. And most of them I think haven't done that inner work yet, and that's just I think a disappointment most times. And yeah, I mean, for someone to date a woman of color, especially someone like me who's very much like in this space, who works with this population, who speaks on racial trauma, does trainings on racial trauma, and who's been affected by, racism and things like that. Like I am just very aware and mindful that, yeah, even some people that I'm friends with or people that I'm dating, like I do just kind of I have it on, my Hinge profile that I, into social justice and things like that. And even like the questions that I try to ask people, I am trying to like kind of weed them out because yeah, it is very disappointing, I think, when you find out that someone, makes comments like this, they don't even realize that it's racist, and yeah, don't really want to do any work, and don't want to learn about how they can be better or improve, right? So yeah, it's happened a few times, and I think I will do a whole other episode on kind of, yeah, being being friends, making friends when you're a woman of color, because it has happened to me a lot of times, unfortunately, in Australia, that friendships have ended and things have gotten pretty nasty, and yeah, just a lot of harm. People get defensive and they end up causing us a lot of harm, as we probably sadly know and can relate to. But yeah, I think that's part of, one of the reasons. Another reason is I've just, even with tradie, they call them tradies here, like tradespeople, right? Had bad experiences with tradesmen, and even the last guy who was here, like, supposedly trying to fix my water heater. And, just I asked him a simple question. I asked him if he was going to let the property manager know that I still didn't have hot water, and he all of a sudden just started raising his voice with me and started, like insinuating that I was stupid, that I did have hot water, even though I definitely don't. My neighbor had to offer me a shower because the water was coming up freezing cold. But yeah, just thought that it was okay to yell at me at top of his voice in my own home. And when I asked him to leave, I had asked him like 3 different times, to leave. And it wasn't until I like turned my body away and I happened to have a Zoom call with someone starting, and that's when he finally left. But yeah, I was like, no, and I've just had, similar experiences like that where I'm just like, wow, it just kind of blows me away how what a short fuse, someone can have, and just how they're not used to, like strong, independent women who will just, say things like how they are. Like when I told the guy who was working at a computer store, like I was like, okay, cut the condescending bullshit and just help me. Like I don't need you to talk down to me. Like I just need you to, this is what I need to do. And he was like taken aback and like kind of blown away. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if they're ready for me. I am trying to be open-minded to, like, yeah, and I will still, once in a while, I think still maybe go out on a date with an Aussie or something. But yeah, I am just kind of very watchful now of like, okay, I've had a lot of bad experiences. So yeah, we'll just kind of see. But yes, this episode ended up dragging out. Like anytime I start talking about dating in Australia. But you guys loved the other episode. There were a lot of downloads and questions and engagement and messages on Instagram when I did the dating as a therapist episode. So I thought I'd record this one for you guys. But yeah, feel free to send me a message. Let me know what your experience has been like, in the US or in Australia or anywhere else. Yeah, let's keep the conversation going. It's an interesting one, right? Especially when you date someone from another culture, from another country. So yeah, curious to kind of hear. I love talking about this with friends. I just love hearing different stories, different perspectives. These are, of course, all generalizations. But like I said, this is like my own experience. And yeah, it's probably very different to other people's experiences, of course. But yeah, anyway, thought I'd share. So yes, let me know. Follow me on Instagram at Global Citizen Therapy if you are not following me already. And yeah, if you want to learn how to be super empowered and how to tell guys off, no, not tell guys off, but how to talk to them, especially in the bedroom, make sure that you check out the Breaking Taboos, communicating about sex with confidence as an immigrant daughter. That's a free workshop that I have available, and that link will be in the description of this episode as well, because yes, we can definitely make people uncomfortable, You know what I mean? Like there's not, yeah, not everyone is going to be ready for us to actually say with confidence, like, this is what I want, this is what I need. And yeah, we can make them uncomfortable, and then they can decide, and we can decide, like, do we continue, do we move forward, or are you not ready to actually, communicate? Because I have had those experiences too, where I will communicate something like, no, this is about me too, like we need to both get something out of sex, right? Like I want pleasure too. And the guy will just be like, no, I don't want to do that. And I'll be like, okay, there's the door. Like I just, yeah, I'm just not at that point in my life where I'm just going to waste time like just giving you pleasure and I get nothing out of it. Like, no, that was early 20s me. Like, that's not me anymore, right? So yes, if you want to learn how to communicate with people, even if you make them uncomfortable, but just so that you can actually like learn what your needs are, communicate them, and feel empowered, download that workshop. It's a freebie for you all. So yes, I will leave it there for now, and I will see you all next week. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, I am here to be open, honest, and vulnerable with you because you are not alone. If you want to support this podcast, please make sure to leave a review so others can find it as well. If you're interested in working with me, you can find me at www.globalcitizentherapy.com. And if you'd like to heal your relationship with self-care and learn more about how to find the type of soul care that works for you, you can find the link to my workshop in the description of this podcast episode. Thank you again, and see you next time.